do right or wrong is decided by the amount of civilian casualties in other side in a conflict.
Salma.
Well, this is a really difficult question because we're sat here in a London studio not having faced the conflict in close proximity. And so all I can offer is an opinion, a personal opinion. This is not based on expertise of war or those kinds of decisions that are being made. Ultimately, the loss of innocent life in any context is terrible. It's an awful thing. The things that we are seeing are awful things. And nobody can help feeling the barbarity of what happened on October 7th, and nobody can help feeling a real pain when we're looking at Palestinian children who are dying. So this isn't a question of what is the number. I don't think the question of proportionality is about the number of people dying, but it is about saying that do we need to continue the loss of innocent lives in this way? Now, I absolutely accept and support the fact that Israel faced an atrocious terror attack, and in order to have peace, they need to be able to secure themselves against Hamas. That is absolutely correct. Things around humanitarian aid that is able to go into Palestine and securing safe passage for Palestinians who are not players in this war is something that has to be accounted for. It's not about numbers. It's about decency towards innocence in conflict.
Zack?
I think that was the exact answer. It's not about numbers, it's about decency, and I can only repeat that. First of all, I hope you're okay. I have family who are in Tel Aviv, and I know that this is a difficult time for everyone, whether you're in Israel or in Palestine. I would also say, though, that this conflict did not start on October 7th. And for far too long, Israel has occupied Gaza, and we can get into a whole debate about the history of conflict, and that probably the road to madness. But I think it is important to point out the disproportionality here. I don't necessarily agree with the idea that this country shares the Israeli government's cultural values. Netanyahu is a far-right leader. You could argue that we've started in this country to share those values, but I'd like to think that this country stands for compassion and decency. So I would reject the question in terms of it's not about numbers. Every single innocent life is an innocent life lost, and ultimately the blood of Palestinian children has to be worth the blood of Israeli children.
We don't talk about this word proportionality in any other conflict. It's only to do with Israel that this word is ever brought up.
I'm not sure about that. I think in Ukraine as well, I think the horrific scenes that we saw from Putin in terms of proportionality, obviously, again, it's very different because that, essentially, as I said before, not to compare conflicts, but that ultimately is about proportionality too. I think the shock of what we saw was the proportionality and the kind of horrific attacks. And I think when we're seeing nightly on our screens what is going on in Gaza, and the idea, even if Hamas are in a hospital, the idea that then that is acceptable to bomb a hospital because it's a military target, again, it's not coherent and it's not compassionate and it's not humane. And what I'm saying...
War is not compassionate. This is where I think a lot of people go wrong in this. If you are a country fighting a war, and that's what Israel believes it is doing, and I mean we can have a debate about that, but they're calling it a war. In war, within international law, within the Geneva Convention, terrible things happen. I mean, if you believe that you should never go to war, and because you would end up killing civilians inevitably, no matter how much you target, inevitably there will be civilian casualties, then you're a pacifist. Now, perfectly honourable to be a pacifist, but let's just get people to admit that's what they're advocating.
Yeah, so I'm not a pacifist. I think that, there are instances where you absolutely need to defend yourself, but let's look at international law. It determines that collective punishment is not acceptable. And
Israel denies that it's doing that.
But I think anyone only needs to look at the conflict for about 30 seconds. And, 6 genocide scholars have said that what is going on is genocide. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that. I think it's too soon for me to start prevaricating about what's going on with international law. But I think the idea that they're not committing war crimes is for the birds. I think it's very clear when you see whole areas just razed to the ground and hospitals being bombed. This is this has gone beyond a war crime, and it ultimately needs to be condemned. And as I say, the biggest thing that needs to be condemned is the loss of civilian life, whether that's in Israel or in Palestine. But that shouldn't take away from our, as in the UK, our moral responsibility to talk to Israel as a critical friend and not give them a blank check.
But the Prime Minister says that's exactly what he's been doing. And if you look at what he's said, both in the House of Commons and in press conferences, he's gone out of his way to say that Israel must obey international law in a way that a close ally, you would think, wouldn't need to say that.
The Prime Minister also said that he hopes that Israel wins, but no one is winning here. The only thing that is winning here is death.
He's not going to say he hopes that Hamas wins, is he?
No, he's not. But ultimately, this idea of winning and losing neglects the idea of a peace agreement and of a settlement. And it's worth saying Hamas are already negotiating. They're negotiating over the release of hostages. So this idea that Hamas would never negotiate is not true.
But sorry, is Hamas not negotiating as a consequence of force?
Yes, that is true. But ultimately, where does that force stop? Does it stop when we've killed 100,000 people, 200,000 people? Like, at what point do we go enough killing is enough?
If you had been the Israeli government on October the 8th, what would you have done? I mean, they surely had no alternative but to launch some sort of... Now, you can argue about the extent of it, but they clearly had to launch some sort of military action against Hamas, didn't they?
I think I'd argue about the extent of it, and we're straight back into that conversation about proportionality, and I think that's exactly why proportionality does come up in Israel and Gaza, because ultimately you're dealing with a government with huge military might against people who are often fighting with sticks and stones.
Sam?
So I think the proportionality is not about adding up numbers in a column. I think that's very clear to the sort of question that was asked. And I don't think any of us are arguing that. For me, the question is, what is the end game here? What is Israel trying to achieve in the action that it's taking? Is there a coherent plan to actually eradicate Hamas militarily? Is there a political solution if they were able to do that? It's not clear to me that there is. It's pretty clear from what the Americans are saying, who are the people who are closest to the Israelis, that they don't think that there is, and that there is a lot of worry in the international community about how we extricate both Israel and Gaza from this situation that they're in, when both sides think that they are now essentially in an existential war. And it's not clear to me that anybody has a clear answer to that. It's all very well calling for ceasefires and negotiations, but it is not clear that anyone has a mechanism at the moment either to start that process or what that would look like. I don't think it's going to be possible for the Israeli government to agree to have Hamas running Gaza anymore, but it's not also very difficult to see how you stop that from happening. So it feels like this conflict is going to last for quite a lot longer.
Jessica?
I agree with everything that Sam's just said in terms of the current situation and why it's renders almost impossible to even begin to look, unfortunately, at moving towards any sort of negotiations. In terms of the loss of life, we're all plainly agreed, of course we all are here on the panel, and any decent person would be concerned about the loss of any civilian life. I would also extend the concerns that there are for the hostages taken from Israel at the moment in just the most horrifying terms, the descriptions that we've had of what has happened on the 7th of October. And I think that Hamas repeating today that they will do it again and again and again until Israel's annihilated. That's a stark reminder of the threat that Israel as a democracy faces. And yes, I mean, there's one part in the world where if things couldn't be more complicated in terms of the history and its religion, its geography, it's everything. It's all confined in that area. So I'm not in any way moving away from it being hugely complex. But when I see it in a sense of a terrorist attack, and I think Israel must do and must be supported in its action that it's taking.
Maybe there is a glimmer of light in that I saw yesterday that a minister in the United Arab Emirates was supporting Israel, and somebody, a leading figure in Saudi Arabia, had publicly supported Israel. And I'm thinking, well, this could never have happened even 5 years ago. And maybe the sort of the old barriers are beginning to splinter. And I suspect it'll take a long time, but I think that there's always been back-channel talks between Israel and Arab countries. And I know Jordan today withdrew their ambassador, but I suspect that's more for public show, and there's still talks going on.